Okay, I'm calling on Prime Minister.
Oh, I assume I'm still audible.
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Global inequities are reinforced by limited access to life-changing technology that exists at the time. Nigeria has shown great capacity for technological innovation and growth. They have a booming tech market themselves. They also have a largely educated workforce that is particularly educated in the matters of technology and computer science. It is time then for them to capitalize on it to the benefit of their own citizens and to broader benefits for Africa as a whole. Firstly, I'm going to explain in terms of setup what this looks like and why this is likely to be done well, and what does it being done well actually look like. Secondly, why this massively improves the prospects for people in Nigeria. And then thirdly, why you have broader benefits to African nations in terms of removing themselves from extractive industries, providing benefits to all their citizens across Africa, but also removing themselves from the independence of extractive industries and oil. First, let's go into setup. So obviously, charter city is going to look like what it says in the info slide. You get these city officials that create rules and regulations around that in terms of commercial regulation and not other forms of criminal jurisdiction, for example. We would basically have those charter cities out there in terms of like 10-year contracts or 20-year contracts, providing enough time for those companies to set up those long-term structures that they're likely to have, and they can renew that and they can be renewed if Nigeria thinks that is good and those companies haven't done something really bad. In terms of encouraging people, companies to come there, I think firstly, just by allowing it, it's likely to happen because it's a unique program and you're providing these companies with a lot of control and setting up unique systems and cities directly to benefit technology, innovation, and those companies. And I think that in terms of attracting those kinds of companies, it's the fact that you allow it is enough itself. Nigeria has an educated workforce and a booming tech industry, as I've already mentioned, but specifically we think Africa as well, because of that integration and modernization of a lot of things in terms of agriculture, are likely to integrate tech really easily into those kinds of industries because there's no path dependency already. So you can modernize agriculture much quicker than you can do in other countries, other areas and regions, but also telecommunication, those kinds of things. I'll take the clarification from CEO if OO is not a clarification.
So you can model in this motion, and my question is, who pays for these cities? Is it the government or the companies? And if you don't want to model, like, what do you think is likely?
I think you can't really model. You can explain what is likely in terms of what the Nigerian government is going to do. And I think the info slide kind of suggests that they're already doing this, right? And I think the information in the info slide as to how it sets it up is very likely to happen like that. The broader consideration of what it looks like, I'll talk about very shortly. In terms of who's likely to come in terms of these companies, it looks like just the big tech companies, Huawei, Apple, Alphabet, Meta. You're probably also going to get chip manufacturers and chip designers like NVIDIA, who specifically cater to things like AI in terms of their chips being particularly good and sophisticated for the uses of large machine learning systems to be able to capitalize on that kind of system. The uses of this specifically in Nigeria look like climate analysis in terms of where you should grow crops and specific targeting of where crops should be grown, especially in the changing nature that climate change is having to Africa. We think that is likely then in those instances for those companies to come anyway, but we would further provide subsidies for setting it up and lowering taxes and those kinds of things. As in terms of who's going to pay for this, obviously Nigeria will put in a large amount of money as it's required to incentivize companies to come in, but to the extent that we think that this is a very lucrative opportunity for a lot of those companies, the companies are likely to compete on those charters by saying that they require less money than other companies, and we think that race to the bottom is really good in saving money for Nigeria. This is likely to be done well for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because they've done it before in terms of like building Talent City and stuff like that. There are a lot of special economic zones that already exist in Nigeria. One is given to Indian companies, one is given to Chinese companies, for example, and they have all those structures in place and regulations and laws already in place to deal with the differences between special economic zones and the rest of the country. So they have an experience basically in governing these individual cities that are specifically made for economic outcomes. The final thing there is companies want to get those benefits, so they're likely to take some time in setting up those long-term infrastructure and educational impacts in bringing the workforce into it from other countries around them, but also upskilling Nigerian locals. And that means in order to get that renewed, they need to show some sort of improvement on the system that already exists. They need to show Nigeria that it's worth having the company in there. And again, the vast benefits that a company can get from basically having a foothold in Africa and being able to sell their products and create products specifically in that local environment, that is, they have a captured market in those instances, means that the companies are likely to come there. So that competition with companies means that it's easy to swap because the infrastructure remains the same overall. You can easily boot out a company if they start contravening your rules or doing something really bad, or not just giving back to the community the way that they should be doing, because it's very easy to just fit in another company into that infrastructure. Before I go on to the many, many benefits you get for the Nigerian individuals, I think the setup was broadly fine. If anyone has any questions, go ahead. Yes. Oh.
Why can't you let the Nigerian government set these cities up themselves using the lease fees that these companies would pay to the government anyways?
So I think there's a relative amount of competition that exists for those companies. I think Ethiopia also has a booming tech industry. So obviously to be more competitive, we would do this in order to encourage companies to come in. But I think our claim from opening a government goes far beyond that. And that is letting them have that control over those cities and setting up cities specifically for those companies in terms of the infrastructure is the best way to capitalize on tech growth and tech innovation. So what does it look like? It looks like building an ecosystem much like you have in Silicon Valley, right? This is the second point about benefits. When you have those tech companies in there, and there might be many tech companies very close together, creating and innovating and competing against each other. You also get universities that move in there. You can set up universities specifically for technology that have lectures by those individuals who are heading those departments. You have banks that set up next door to them, so they're able to provide venture capitalism and provide those kinds of loans to those companies. Those streamlined connections and deals are a unique opportunity for Nigeria to do when they set these unique cities up, as opposed to integrating them into already existing cities or already existing areas. And that is why specifically we would like to do this in order to capitalize on the same system that Silicon Valley, for example, has. This means you're likely to get training and upskilling of individuals because it requires people to work in their already good tech graduates who can get more specialized training in those fields. It's more cheaper to do that than upskilling locals and bringing other people in, because those individuals who work for much lower salaries, and for the long term, you're likely to get further benefits by doing that training. So it's provided the contract's far enough, in the future, you're able to get that kind of investment into the education of your people. But also you have backlash if you don't do that, because China and India, for example, have much different reactions by the population, because China, when they don't show they're giving back to the locals, actually has a lot of backlash from people that work there. We think that means companies are likely to give back in that way. But also integration of local needs means you need to bring local experience in there in order to have that kind of integration of technology there. People will move in, you get tax, you get rates, you get jobs and money, and the service economy around that also benefits people, because people have to move in to provide the services and housing for other individuals. That's a lot of money. That is huge outcomes for people in Nigeria that provide them the extra upskilling they need to compete, but also provides jobs to millions of people. Broader benefits in the region very quickly. We give people those skills, but we also move people away from extractive industries that have environmental harm and aren't going to be long-termists because of peak oil we've already reached. We move people away from back-breaking agricultural work, and we give specific technology to those individuals locally situated in order for them to mitigate the worst harms of climate change. Proud to be OG.
Thank you so much. Calling on LO.
Right, shall we check if I can be heard and seen?
Yes to both.
Thanks very much. Pronouncing him, my name is Sompoom. You can call me Sam. Verbal PI is highly welcome in unprotected time. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On the panel, PM still couldn't respond why governments cannot be the ones setting up these cities, right? Take the comparison here. The companies, their only motive is for profit. They're not even Nigerian companies in many of the cases, like they use Chinese and Indian companies, right? Their only motive is to please the nations, to please the shareholders, and get the profit. There's no incentive whatsoever to please the people of Nigeria. On the other hand, governments, we're going to engage with the worst case scenario possible on our side, that governments are corrupt, governments are inefficient, governments are incompetent. Even if you take all these three as true, you see that governments at the very least have some incentives to gain voter approval, right? Just to make sure they win the election, or at least don't get cooled in a sense, right? So that is the incentive at the very least, proving that out of these two actors, it is the governments who care more about the people. And that is the metric we think this debate must be won by. Economic development benefits that benefit the average Nigerian individual, not the CEO of any Nigerian company, not the Nigerian government, not some shareholder in India or China owning these foreign companies that would come to Nigeria. It is the Nigerian people who are the most vulnerable in this debate, who are the ones who need the employment, who need the economic upliftment up the social ladders, right? Our counterfactual on OO is very simple. We'll have special zones that look like, for example, Shenzhen in China. These are ones that are government run and built and are set up charter cities by the government themselves. The government basically charges leases to these companies, right? For example, upon the city being built, they would just ask the companies that, yeah, this is what we're offering to you. We're offering you like reduced tax rates within these zones, for example. We're offering you like visa-free travel for all passports around the world, like Shenzhen does, for example, that will allow companies to like benefit from these kinds of advantages within these special zones, right? These are the kind of benefits like governments are able to offer, and therefore they're able to like collect lease money from these companies to fund the construction of those cities that's going to have like much better infrastructure than the rest of the country, right? We think in a sense, like companies benefit here when we also have these kind of charter cities built by the governments, and they wouldn't be inclined to buy these kinds of leases from the governments. Legislation, right? First, you get things like reduced tax rates and travel and like visa-free travel. These kinds of things, it's unclear on side OG and government bench how exactly you can get any better than this, better kind of law and privileges from the government in a world where it is not the government directly doing these, right? We think governments, if they are running these cities, they would have every incentive to give them the best benefits possible to make sure that their city sells and doesn't seem like a failure. But secondly, government would like be able to build many infrastructure, for example, like airports and ports that like a single company city just simply cannot, right? So we rival on the utility of these cities that are built by the government are most likely going to have better and larger infrastructure, and it's also going to be larger in scale, leading to like economies of scale that my second speaker will extend more on. First, two rebuttals. First, they said companies need cities to be custom tailored to them. That's why governments cannot be the ones building, right? First, government also have the incentive to want credit and like reduce backlash if their city fails. So they would want to sell out all the leases as soon as possible. So they inevitably would make the city like good for the companies and in a way that is tailored so more companies do buy the leases and move there. Second rebuttal, they said that companies have great experience with successful cities. My question is, was it successful for who? Not the Nigerian people. These are companies that maybe they had their own cities, right? Back in China and India, but note that these cities were only successful because they made profit for the company. That's the premise on OG that like we have to engage with, right? These cities were not like proven as successful even for benefiting the local people of India that much, even if it did. But even if it did benefit the local people of India, the incentives are different. Like in China, you were constantly heckled by CCP to make sure that you weren't exploiting your workers, that you were actually benefiting the economy and not yourself. That is not the case in Nigeria anymore, right? We think it's important that like these companies are held accountable better on our side. Our first substantive is that privately set up cities gentrify locals from economically capitalizing on its economic activities. What's the framing of this? When there's a private city that is set up by a company, companies want to reduce costs and increase profits, right? They obviously want to like manage and build their own utility and support system for the high income staff that live there in the sense, right? What usually happens when there's also high income workers living in a certain area or country is that there is a trickle down effect where the local economy is able to benefit from their like economic power, right? For example, when you're a high income individual, you're obviously gonna like want to buy and rent homes. That's gonna provide income for the economy. You're obviously gonna want to have to like buy and rent and buy food, for example, or do services and go to like places around there to enjoy your life. And that's obviously gonna benefit the local economy. So this is not gonna happen for two reasons. First, privately set up cities by companies are oftentimes like restrictive. Like companies have the final say on who gets to live, who gets to do what business on there. And the main incentive is usually to give the benefits and privileges of selling and doing economic activities that are profitable to like their own companies or their own like kind of allies, which are oftentimes very large MNCs, or even if they're local companies that are larger ones owned by billionaires and not the local people, like local shops and local restaurants, for example, right? On our side of the house, at the very least, the government has the incentive to please people. So they're probably not going to gentrify a lot of people, right? Or even if it's a newly set up city, they'll probably give agency and freedom for citizens of their own country that are literally going to vote for them to be able to like do businesses in these kind of stuff and benefit from the introduction of those companies being in the country, for example. So that looks like the comparative is simple. On our side, things like restaurants, for example, will be able to operate better and like to get profit from these companies. But this doesn't only look on the levels of restaurant. It also looks on the level of just employment into these companies itself, right? At the very least, when you have privately set up cities, a city set up by the governments themselves, every citizen is free to work or live there, right? So at the very least, like you can get like more hiring options. But if it's these companies making their own cities, there can be very restrictive on what kind of people they let and not let live in their city. For example, like they would prefer, for example, if it's a Chinese company, maybe all the high-paying jobs would restrict to only Chinese people, right? There's no comparative advantage of hiring like the locals anyway, because it's like they're not living in the city and the company entirely controls who gets to live and not live in the city. But for moving on one PY, closing.
So historically, in the status quo, these countries usually struggle to have the capital to set up these cities, which means that your likely counterfactual is that tech companies just go to existing cities rather than governments setting up new cities.
We already proved that governments can fundraise through like selling leases even before the city is built, right? They can promise many benefits like reduced tax and visa-free travel, and those are already very attractive and reasons why many companies would come. But now flipping that PY on its head, why foreign companies would be more likely to invest in Nigeria on our side of the house than compared to side opposite on government. Firstly, building a whole new entirely city is only in the dreams of a few selected companies. Very few companies even have the capability, even if they wanted to build an entirely new city. It takes billions of dollars, half a decade to do so at the very least, right? We want to know what do companies come in and what do companies want out of these charter cities on both sides. They want things like legislative, which our side like provides, like for example, special tax laws, or they want things like infrastructure, which our side provides better. You're probably not going to be able to build an entirely new airport if you're a single company, but at least on our side, when government pulls the money of many companies together, they're able to like give like better infrastructure, for example, like large scale shipping ports or like kind of like world class bypass airports for these sense, right? So now we get more companies into Nigeria in the very first place that wouldn't have chosen Nigeria because on side government, the initial setup cost is much, much higher. On our side, at least you can lease to like maybe hundreds of thousands of companies. So the same $10 billion city is only like a fraction of its price that the company would have to pay if they really set up their own city. The comparative here is simple. This is the most important argument in this debate because when companies and foreign companies are more likely to come into Nigeria, there's better employment opportunities. There are things like better competition within the local market for products, so consumers get better and cheaper products. There's things, for example, like companies being able to come and develop the country with their capital more when the barrier to entry to these countries and to Nigeria is much lower on our side. For all these reasons, never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you. Calling on DPM.
Oh, just checking that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Awesome. At the top of the speech, let's make it really clear, this is only about things like commercial regulation at the city level. So it's about things like contracts and business deals and setting like local taxation and being able to collaborate on local infrastructure projects. It's not about setting things like immigration policy or workplace discrimination laws that are obviously going to be set at a national level and not by the city. So I think this means that a lot of the like restrictive hiring practices material that we heard from OO isn't what this debate is about, and it's clearly far more about local issues and how to best set up the city in order to attract companies. The second thing that I think needs to be really clear is there was no response to the really important framing about why Nigeria is a particularly attractive location for the tech industry, and that's really crucial because it means that when you give good regulations, it means that you are far more likely to get a company coming. Cool. Few things to do in this speech. Firstly, dealing with OO's material on gentrification. Secondly, going over large clash on will this be done well. Thirdly, which side is more able to attract them. And then lastly, going over the massive benefits that we get by having these companies here in the most productive way possible that we get under opening government. Right. The random claim that we get from opening opposition is about gentrification, but I think the really important thing to note here is that obviously you get a much higher paying job under our side because you actually have this company here as opposed to like your low paying in the comparative when the company's not there. So I think that it's good, particularly if you did like own your land previously and it rises in value, but also you are likely able to afford this given that you have a much better job. That's really important. Second, really key thing to note about why this is going to be done well is obviously the government is giving out these contracts. So sure, so this means that as the government, you're very unlikely to want to give this to a company which is going to implement this in a bad way. So it means that you're incredibly likely to be able to give out contracts in a way that means that the companies aren't likely to be exploiting laws, but rather you're doing it in a way that is the best way to get collaboration and to still have government insight. Obviously, that means that all of the material about how it's better when you have it done through the government because they have the political interest of the Nigerian people is material that we still have under our side because they're able to influence which contracts the government renews, which contracts the government gives out. But importantly, once that happens, we then leave it in the hands of the company, who is the group that is best placed to know which regulations are going to be the best in terms of making them more efficient, who is the best actor in terms of determining where the combined government and private funding should go in terms of do we need this train line going here or do we need this money to instead be built on building something like an airport. That's the type of control that gets given after the contract is given, and that's when it's really important that you do have the companies making decisions that are best for them, because I think that when you do it through a purely government lens, then you're likely to not be doing it in the way that makes the companies expand as much. And obviously all of the benefits that we've brought you about having increased tax, about having increased jobs, and about being able to diversify away from the sector is material that you only get when you have this company in the most efficient way possible. Second thing to say is even we can accept that maybe in the short term there might be a slight harm of this not being implemented perfectly, but obviously you're able to learn from your mistakes and replicate the good cities, the cities that did work out the best way possible in terms of being able to have an effective partnership that was able to maximize profit for the company and was therefore able to maximize the amount of money that's going back to Nigeria through tax and in terms of being able to have the company hiring as many people as possible. And so I think this means that once this policy is implemented over a long term, we think we're able to get massive benefits in terms of replicating the most effective ones. And the last thing to say here in terms of why this is incredibly likely to be done well is obviously there's going to be a high degree of competition for these contracts, because I think as a company it would be great if I was able to have significant influence over the laws that are set in terms of the like corporate deals that I'm able to have, in terms of having a strong ability to like enforce my like copyright and my patents. So I think that means that there's many companies that will want this, and so they're willing to do things like say, oh, I will fund 50% of this project. The government only has to put the government partnership only has to be a smaller proportion of this money, and that means that's incredibly likely to be done well. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
So to be clear, this isn't a case about incentive. You're not telling me that the government is corrupt and companies are better. You're just saying that companies do this better and the government is good at its job. Is that the clear case you're making?
We've told you that companies are best placed in terms of being able to maximize the profits for them, and that is best placed for the and that is the thing that is the best for Nigeria in the long run, because you're able to get all of the massive economic benefits that we've told you in terms of having higher tax, in terms of having more jobs, in terms of being able to set up a service economy around having those higher number of jobs and higher paying jobs, in terms of being able to diversify your economy. Obviously, capitalism works incredibly effectively in terms of being able to maximize that economic benefit and being able to develop industry. Let's talk about why we're able, why even if if opening opposition's policy is still implemented well, why is it likely to be better through the way that we set it up? Because when we have this company government partnership, when this company government partnership that is only possible under opening government and under having the specific policy, that means that you're able to set that means that you're able to have programs done that can't just be done by a government. So it looks like having companies that are able to run a university or run a high school and teach the skills that are most in demand for being able to effectively work in that factory, or being able to learn the skills that are going to be most useful for your supply chain. That's the type of thing that they can't do, but that's the type of thing that we're able to do. Again, that means that it's far more productive under our side, and so we have a much larger economic benefit, even if you think they still have some degree of economic benefit. Again, for all of the reasons that we've told you about being able to diversify Nigeria's economy in terms of being able to get tax revenue and get high-skilled jobs, that's incredibly important. Obviously, this in the long run is going to be worth the setup cost for the government putting a bit of money, but we think that because of the competition, it means that companies are going to be doing the large part of this. They get benefits, and those benefits then flow on to Nigeria. Very proud to propose.
Thank you, calling on DLO.
Got this. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
More person. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there is one fundamental issue with OG's case, right? That they're not being mutually exclusive. They've not been able to prove why the benefits that they talk about do not exist on our side, right? They never really engage with our case, and they only push for benefits, right? They tell us many things, right? They talk about machine learning systems, about how there'll be better climate analysis, how there'll be infrastructure like the Silicon Valley, and how different universities will be set up. However, they never prove why necessarily does the charter cities need to be set up by the tech company for this to exactly happen, right? On our side, my previous speaker already came and told you that how the governments will be able to finance the startup costs anyway, right? And recognize they do not really give you a clear picture of what this looks like, right? When we tell you that on their side, on side government, you have a public, when you have a privately funded charter city that is funded by a single large tech company, then usually all the costs are being like bared by them, right? That's why they're getting all the benefits, right? So on our side, firstly, on ability of the government to finance the startup cost, right? My previous speaker already touched upon this. I'll be emphasizing more about how the government has like many sources of revenue, like tax revenue, issuing bonds, and even borrowing at low interest from like World Bank or IMF, who's like which literally exists to like invest in these poor developing nations, right? Secondly, on incentive, right? Recognize that government ensures sound competition. They have the literal incentive to do so, right? Because they intervene in a market when it is necessary, and in general, they ensure welfare for everybody, right? To make sure everything is going well, right? That's why like antitrust laws like occur, and then that's why they have other commercial laws that benefit most people, right? Or at least for the economic growth of the country, right? Recognize how this significantly differs from a tech company, right? Which probably has a profit incentive, who once they get the power to set up their charter city, that is what they'll be using it for, right? They'll be shaping commercial regulations in a way that is advantageous to them only, right? Not just the entire country. And this is largely problematic, right? Recognize, what does this mean? This means that they'll be using tools within the commercial laws, right? What do these tools look like, right? They look like tariff rates, tax rates, right? And other various laws that influence how you conduct business in this special area, right? Recognize company, this means that if you're a rival company to this company, you will never enter this zone, right? Because once this company that has set up this region gets the information about your cost, right? Maybe they know that you rely heavily on imports, then they suddenly increase the tariff rates, because that is how you drive away competition. Recognize that once you give so much power to this company is now a monopoly within the region, because of which it is significantly harmful, right? Now I'll be impacting this, right? Recognize the harms that come with stifling competition, right? When these big conglomerates with immense wealth are the ones building these cities, right? Recognize they're already existing monopolies in the market, right? Because currently we don't have foreign competition, right? And that is exactly what we don't want, right? Because of which they're more likely to win bids, right? Because for the reasons that they're wealthy in the first place, and they will be accepting the bids in order to gain and maintain their monopoly power, in order to build profit incentive. If you pay close attention to the info slide, you can already see how it is a Nigerian entrepreneur who actually set up this city, right? Now, in your best case, you may be talking about how competition exists only if, like, say, there are two charter companies where, like, each are competing, right? Recognize this is immensely costly, and I'll be getting onto this later in my speech, right? So, firstly, on how the lack of competition leads to various impacts, right? Recognize when government creates incentives for various companies to set up businesses in a special economic zone, right? Because that is our counterfactual, right? The government can make sure that everyone can come, right? Because of which they encourage foreign direct investment, meaning that various companies come and they can set up their business, right? Because of which on our side, it is very exclusive that competition exists, right? Because the government introduces tax rates and tariff rates that are favorable to these companies, right? To these companies. So now they have an advantage to like go compare their rates to other countries, right? And say, like, let's say Rwanda is the next best alternative, right? Then I'll be taking a later. So then you increase your tax rate depending on what Rwanda does, right? Because of which the government still gets certain tax revenue that still goes to other people, right? Recognize this is how it is significantly better, right? Also recognize that on our side, you have both foreign companies and big local corporations as well, right? Everyone competing against each other. On their side, we only have one big company, whether they're foreign company or a local company, right? It does not really matter. They get a significant edge over their competition because they have a literal big city where they can literally mass produce and just take advantage of the monopoly power, right? Before that, I'll be taking our closing.
Yeah, government isn't good at policy experimentation because they literally have administrative law that force them to compare and contrast projects, write a lot of reports, and also have to have tons of stuff, which means they're inefficient.
I think regardless, right, even if they do have to support reports, what difference does it make? They still have power over commercial laws. That is exactly why these companies want to come in the first place, right? Because of which these impacts still stand, right? All these commercial laws, including like tax rate, tariff rates, and whatnot, right? All these different tools that they can use to give themselves advantage, right? Because that's exactly how they earn money, right? Recognize on our side that number of companies increasing means directly that the city can expand and that there will be more and more jobs being created, meaning the level of employment we create is significantly larger, right? Moving on to my next analysis about how there'll be external economies of scale, right? And what do I mean by this, right? Recognize when you have better resource utilizations, when you have many different companies using the same network, right? Meaning that the government invests in a common infrastructure that everyone uses, right? Recognize that it is not just one company benefiting, but like many companies who work in this operation, right? The entire supply chain exists here, each with its own competition, right? However, this is not possible inside government. Why? Because one tech company, let's take an example of a chip manufacturer, right? This chip manufacturer now has immense bargaining power, right? They are the only ones here and they can charge a high premium for the chip, right? Because of which other markets are influenced, right? Like for example, like laptop manufacturers or whatnot, right? Other laptop manufacturers or other product manufacturers, whoever uses chips now suffer due to this, right? Because of which only the one gaining is the chip manufacturer. But because of competition being stifled in these other markets, the entire economy is at a disadvantage, right? Recognize that Nigeria has to compete with other nations, right? For example, Rwanda, like I previously said, right? Companies want a nation that is quick and cheap to set up, right? Because of which the barrier of entry need to be low, right? If a company has to set up, instead the government takes billions, right? Half a decade, it takes like a long time to build, right? Most companies don't have large enough profits from having their own city anyway, right? Because of which side government loses this debate, right? Recognize that on our side, in my speech, I've proven exclusivity, right? How the external economies of scale is likely to trickle down to other markets, and because of which all the market within the technology sector is actually likely to improve, right? And I've also proved why the government is likely to be the best actor in this debate in order to make sure an even playing field, right? For all these reasons, opposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Calling on member of government.
Hey, can I be heard?
Yep.
My extension will answer the question provided by opening opposition, which is why is our case mutually exclusive to theirs? We're going to prove why it is only when companies set up these cities that you get the kinds of benefits that OG talks about. It's only when companies are the ones setting up these cities that you actually have investor confidence, that you have companies coming to Nigeria in the first place. There's going to be three parts to this. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the vested interest of corporations. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about policy and business experimentation. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about investor confidence and image. Firstly, in terms of vested interests, I guess the best analogy to this is if you are somebody, if someone builds a house for you and then they rent it out for you, you know that at any point you could be kicked out or you might find a different house or something like that, which means that you have no vested interest in terms of like improving the house, decorating it and all that kind of stuff. The comparison is when you have to build a house yourself and that house is yours, then you have more incentives to decorate it because you've already sunk a lot of cost in it. And therefore, in order to pay off those fixed and sunk costs of building the house, you want to stay there for a long time to extract profit over the long run rather than just like, you know, living there for a night and then going to another place. But you obviously also take care of that place a lot more because you see it as yours, because the profits of that place are directly yours. And you know that, for example, if you install a very, very nice bathroom, that within like, you know, a few years, someone else isn't just going to free ride off that really, really nice bathroom. I'll take a point from you guys. You seem quite desperate.
Your entire case relies on the contract either being permanent or really long. That's also possible on our side of the house. How is that even mutually exclusive?
Well, so the thing is to say is that it's not so much contact, it is more so much who put the work into investing it, in terms of like the corporation is the one that is putting in the cost and sinking the cost to generate that city in the first place, versus on your side when governments are the ones burdened with that. So in terms of vested interest, when a city already exists because a government has set that up and it merely just allows corporations to come in, for example, then one, corporations don't bear the cost, which means that corporations obviously don't have a vested interest in extracting profit long term because they haven't sunk any commitment yet. But secondly, it means that they have no guarantee of exclusivity, because at any point the government can kick them out because the city has corporation has very few assets that they can say is theirs. So it's very easy to kick them out, versus when a corporation has contracts that have already established and buildings that is built itself, the government can't just take the buildings away from it, because that would be a breach of its right to private property, which means that when a corporation has very short-term interests as a tenant of a rented area, they are far more likely to do things like extractive industry. So for tech companies, this looks like in the short run, flying in workers or using remote workers rather than hiring local people, and not setting up any long-term tech infrastructure, things like, very highly advanced optic fiber cable networks and all that kind of stuff. Comparatively, under our side, when corporations feel like they have sunk a fixed cost and need to pay it off, and therefore there's an actual commitment, but also they know that they have a monopoly over area because they've set up the infrastructure and they have exclusive rights over that infrastructure and they have control over that area, that's when they're far more likely to do long-term investment projects, more likely to employ and train people locally because they know that these people can be useful. The second reason, and this is the second part of my extension of why we need to do this, is that of experimentation. Opening government is just like, well, there's competition, and then their analysis just stops there. And it's not really the strongest mechanism either, because obviously only one company can set up one city at a time. You're not really having like 5 companies set up one city, so the competition mechanism there is unclear. I guess the more prevalent mechanism is that of experimentation, which is that obviously different companies can, in different charter cities, do different business policies and corporate practices and find out what works efficiently. This is really important in the context of Nigeria, because Afrotech is super nascent and you need to find out how you can best utilize your talent pool according to local standards, community cultures, and local business practices. Now, importantly, this isn't actually possible with a government, and that is for 3 reasons. Firstly, you get bureaucratic contagion because the people you get to build that city are people from the government, and those people have already existing ideas or practices of ways of administration, existing ways of education. Secondly, the government is the one that shoulders the political and economic risk, which means that they're averse to experimentation. Because if the government is the one that is paying a lot of money, then it obviously has to answer to things like political mandates and not have that city fail, which means it doesn't want to take those risks. Versus a tech company that is now that on our side is the one shouldering the risk. They can do what they want because that doesn't have contagion effects spread back to the Nigerian people. And thirdly, obviously, this gets linked with bureaucratic impediments, things like reports, things like legal disputes and all that kind of stuff, because it is the central government taking care of that. Compare this with when tech companies themselves shoulder the risk. They're far more scope to do experimentation. And this experimentation is very, very useful, not only because you can get good charter cities, but also the Nigerian government in the future can model other cities or model other projects off the business practices that these cities have already developed, which means you get a really good progression in the terms of the country overall. But there's no appetite to do this experimentation when the experimenter is also the one, is also the government that itself is shouldering the burden of its government failing. Lastly, let's talk about investor confidence. There's 2 parts under this. The first part to say here is that you get far more investor confidence when there is already a customer in the midst, which is to say that when you are building a city, you have to sink a lot of cost into building the city first, and then you have to find a tenant, right? Like you have to find a company or maybe multiple companies. I don't know, it's never specified in opening opposition. It's out of time. You guys can put your head down. I already took a POI. But yeah, like multiple companies coming in, all that kind of stuff, which means that there's a massive confidence gap because we don't know whether this company will, whether the city will actually be successful. Compare this to when Google itself is setting up a city, which means every investor in the world already knows that Google is there, and Google obviously has a very good reputation, which means that if it is Google constructing the city, there is a customer already locked in with the building per se, which means that there is far more investor confidence far more people are willing to put their money in, and the city is far, far more likely to be successful compared to when you have an empty house and you're looking for a tenant, which is the thing that opposition must support. Lastly, there are massive image benefits when you have the company as opposed to the Nigerian government being the one that sets up the city. Because obviously people from the West have very shady ideas about what African governments look like. They think they're very corrupt. They think they have poor management. But people do think that these companies have good reputations, good ability to manage and all that kind of stuff versus a volatile and corrupt government, which means that when it's a company setting up the city, you're far more likely to get things like expats and encourage foreign workers to come in who can invest and build up the city because they feel like the image of the city is far preferable to one of the Nigerian government. For all of these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you. Calling on MO.
Sorry, I hope the chair didn't say anything yet, but it's possible I didn't hear them. Are you there?
Yeah, I called for MO.
Oh shit, sorry. I think my laptop was muted. Okay, so am I clearly audible now?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that delay. All right, I'll take it, please. Opening government once. Just in order. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's make one thing clear. Gov can't say the government is corrupt. I just want to make that very clear. Because if their mechanism is that you're giving someone a contract, and then if they don't stick to the contract, then they will be punished and forced to sort of fix their ways, then they can't also claim that the government is then going to be corrupt when they do it themselves, right? Like the government should have good incentives on both sides for this debate to occur. If it has bad incentives on both sides, then like presumably it's easier to hide money in a brand new development, which people don't know jack shit about, and hence corruption rises. So like that's not the debate. Anyway, the CO extension is going to be extremely simple. You stop getting taxes. And taxes are important because they're spent on things that matter more than just infrastructure. It's going to go above opening opposition. OO does a good job explaining, you need to build infrastructure in these cities. You need to sort of develop the economy by hiring more people, et cetera, et cetera. But what they miss out on is specifically what does the government provide money to that companies never get to? Because OG does tell us that you create more jobs, you get more spending and so on. So I can see a lot of people in these cities sort of earning more money because now there's like more demand for their product. But the big question that I want to point out is who is not benefited at all? Who is the actual person who loses all the money that they were getting in the first place? And our answer is simple. It's people who are like in rural areas farming. It's people who are working in the manufacturing industry. It's the poor people who need food and water from tax resources in the first place. And that's what we're going to win the debate on. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is an explanation of how these cities are built and why the money within them never goes to the people on the ground. So the first thing is that they're huge projects. So they really can't be built in a day. They have to take like often like at least 8 to 9 years and a decade, if not more, because like it's a city. It takes time to build roads. It takes time to build like a completely new plumbing system. But when that happens, often a huge amount of this money that's spent on the city can't be from the government because of very simple, obvious reasons. The first one is that if it's from the government, then the government could have just built the city themselves and it's just about the company running it, in which case the debate wouldn't happen because the new governance and all the sort of benefits the government is giving to these companies wouldn't be relevant. But either way, like realistically, Nigeria doesn't have the money to just set up a bunch of new cities anyway. Realistically, it's what OG points out, which is like you're holding them to account through a contract where some of the money comes to the government, but a huge amount of money comes from the companies, which is what CG also says. What's crucial then is that this group of corporations that probably puts money in isn't just giving it to you for free in the way that David describes it, right? They want a return. And so it's crucial to point out that all the investment benefits CG gives you need to then be weighed off against the possible harms of that retention of profit caused to like other people. But on our side, you can still have huge projects locally. You can invest in growth. You can have the company wanting to develop their own city as opening opposition points out. But the second important thing to point out is that you obviously can stop immigration because the motion says like you can set up your own governance structure. And then OG says commercial things like contracts. Fine. So you just make it illegal to sign a contract with someone living in that city. So not only do these companies have a lot of control over these cities because they paid a lot of money, but also the motion says that they often control the governance system and can control who goes in, who goes out, how much taxation is paid, what the regulations are. And the motion inherently just says that this deregulated. And I think that's sort of the frame in which we need to actually get this debate to go. Okay, where does money go onside op and where does money go onside gov? So if you set up these cities, first of all, it has a huge amount of money that is no longer going to tax funding, but it's going to foreign investment as people try to leave. So if people get richer, often they want to leave the country of Nigeria and go to places like America, go to places like the UK, nicer cities in Europe. And the very simple reason for this is because you want your family to have a better life, and that probably will come in these developed nations. This is brain drain. The thing is, you don't reach the threshold for brain drain on-side government, on-side opposition, because not that many people get rich. Instead, the money is often spread out more because a few people don't earn a lot of that money and then start investing it in businesses. A lot of people earn huge amounts of money that comes from the government because it's spread out and redistributed more. So it's harder for these people to leave and more of them stay in the first place. But second of all, the spending itself also goes to skilled workers. Now, OO is correct that, these might not be the same workers in the tech industry and also the same workers in the city. But what they don't explain is, why doesn't this money ever trickle down in the first place? And that's what CEO will tell you, right? It can't trickle down because the majority of value comes from things that are difficult to do, right? Like, for example, if you're doing consultancy, or for example, you're creating a really cool meal as a chef, most of that value doesn't come from the food that you've gotten or sort of the ingredients that you got. It came from the way that you cooked it. So the more valuable the things you buy are, the more rich you are, the more luxurious your goods are, the more of that money is going to the skilled elite individual who's at the top of that hierarchy. But when you buy something simple, like say a sandwich at a grocery store or a simple dish that people can cook easily, a lot of that money goes to people at the bottom. So the spending itself is lower in the private sector. But finally, you just don't invest locally because you obviously have more money and want to make sure you make more money in the future as well as someone who's making money as a tech sector worker or company, so you invest in other companies. All of this changes on our side for obvious reasons. The first obvious reason is we tax them. The second obvious reason is that you can't actually buy foreign imports or invest in other companies in a country like Nigeria because protectionism is very popular. This is an empirical fact. Like if you look at Tinubu's recent statements, he's been pushing for the idea of stopping free trade. But even if you ignore the frontline pages of African newspapers, it's also structurally likely because in a nation that's poorer, often the fear is to protect the majority of the people who matter the most to the electorate. And the majority of people in Nigeria are poor and work in places like farms and manufacturing sectors. So they don't want people pushing money into companies outside. They want people buying their own stuff, which is why it's protectionist. So a lot of that money is spent locally. But finally, investment is also local because you make it illegal to sort of throw money out into other stock markets, and you make it much more likely that people invest locally. So import taxes, capital controls, all of that means you spend locally. Now I'm going to weigh what the government does with this kind of money, these taxes, all of this kind of stuff. Before that, opening government.
So a lot of the op-bench harms relies on these companies having massive bargaining power to either abuse the control or not pay as much tax. Can you be the first team to engage the framing of how attractive Nigeria is for tech companies and therefore Nigeria has the bargaining power for the charter?
If it's really attractive, then the growth benefits need to be explained to me as to why the margin you get from a large city is so important that it changes people's lives. If I explain growth happens on both sides, but how it's redistributed better, we win. Finally, you say the tech companies don't have a strong bargaining power, and then you say that it's really attractive for tech, which makes no sense to me. Presumably, if the tech companies are really attractive, they have a lot of money, so they can push the government into doing what they want. Finally, your own closing just said you need their money, so keep up, bro. Okay, why is this money spent well? The first thing, obviously, is that you stop the worst type of harms, say healthcare crises where people literally can't pay their medical bills, people who don't have any food in places outside of that city because that money is spent on, say, rural areas. This is bad because these are long-term compounding harms. These are the people who turn into criminals. These are the people who then need huge amounts of spending in terms of welfare. But second, it's about things like subsidizing industries that might not be very profitable, but are crucial in making sure people can continue living their lives. So investing in farming, investing in things like manufacturing sectors that can hire people who no longer will be able to make money by just selling crops, because it's not that easy to continue selling those crops when weathers go bad, and just protecting people in their most vulnerable moments, because these are the things that the economy actually depends on, but companies don't care about. Okay, the impact might not be clear, but Abhishek will weigh that on that closing opposition.
Thank you. Calling on Dr.
Sorry, can I be heard like this?
Audible.
Okay. Sorry for that, Scaff. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If you look closely at closing opposition, they never really dealt with David's case about why on the outside you have a vested interest, why companies would A, want to invest in this place, and B, why they're going to be able to do this well. And I think that there's still no response. But let's look at their case specifically. Firstly, they tell us you spent a significant amount of time and money into this, right? I think that first of all, the problem with their case is a contradiction to opening opposition, because opening opposition strategy is to talk about how instead of companies doing these sanctuary city themselves, these government are going to expand on these infrastructure and build these optical fibers on their side of the house, but it's just the added benefit, right? But secondly, I think that there's going to be like limited tax revenue, and it's not going to be as important because we think that the companies are the people who invested a huge sum of money in the first place. So tax is a moot problem. Secondly, if you're talking about these major companies, the reason why these companies have a significant bargaining power is because you already have a lot of investment put into it. So Nigeria could easily negotiate with them, and therefore they have this incentive to keep this contract for as long as possible. But thirdly, we care more about long-term development, right? And I think this is very important in the context of Nigeria. Notice that in this country, a lot of the times you rely on some primary or secondary industry like extraction or like processing. Oftentimes these eventually have to compete with other developing countries, and there's very little amount of money that you're able to get. Only when you through developing the more higher end, like the service industry, or like these like technologies that gives you a patent where you have a sustainable amount of money, which gives you the money that you need. Like I think that the context about Nigeria is important, because notice that one, geographically, Nigeria is placed like between like in Africa, and it's close to like Middle East, right? Which means they have significant amount of money available from the Middle East, but also because politically it's relatively stable in the region. Therefore, if companies want to tap into the vast market that is being underdeveloped, which is potentially a huge consumer, they have an incentive to do this, right? So in the long term, you get better development. In the long term, you also get far more development. Like lastly, I also think that in the worst case scenario, I think on both sides taxation is harder to get, right? For example, in Ireland, Apple pays 0% tax to the government. In Australia, they also pay 0% tax to Google, for example. I'm unsure where the benefit is. Secondly, if you look at brain drain, that is true for some people, but notice that in the status quo, people leave because oftentimes highly educated people have no ability to go into industry in their own country. Moreover, people don't want to leave actually, because that oftentimes they have their local roots and their family culture being there, right? So what does it mean? If Nigeria is able to provide jobs for these highly skilled workers, people are going to stay. People oftentimes don't leave unless there's like a huge push factor for them, right? Lastly, if we talk about like industry, for example, I think, again, it's like a middle income industry. It is not able to make Nigeria into a developed economy in the future. Okay, way against like opening, well, I'm going to explicitly explain why closing government wins this debate. Firstly, in terms of like vested interest, right? David provides you the most easy way to understand why on outside you're able to get jobs, why on outside you're going to get infrastructure. And I just want to nuance this, right? Because when you're looking at sanctuary city, you're chartering new city for it to be developed, right? What does this oftentimes mean? This oftentimes means you don't have to build optical cables in places where they're already residents. You don't have to, for example, move people outside, and there's no problem of gentrification because oftentimes you're developing in a new place that's relatively cheaper, right? So I think that another characterization is oftentimes these charter cities are pretty small, right? Because you don't need massive amount of like infrastructure. Oftentimes you need optical cable, you need cheap hotels so that you have people flying in whenever there's a summit. It is easy for companies to meet up with banks and other sort of business. You don't need a huge amount of infrastructure to do this, right? And you don't actually run into a conflict with local residents unlike the status quo when you build it in these cities, right? I think second of all, in terms of extension, why experimentation is important. If we weigh up against opening government, the premise about experimentation is important because it's a premise of opening government. Without experimentation, it is difficult to prove that the outcome is good, right? Sure, you're able to prove that they can choose which company to do, but why exactly are these companies going to be successful, and thus we should opt into this policy in the first place, depends on our side of the house, right? But secondly, we also prove to you that because these governments are not shouldering these risks, they are not opted into the political mandate. I think this responds nicely into the opening opposition side, because although they say that these companies are profit incentive and therefore they're not good politically, I think that oftentimes they also get hijacked by the political narrative, right? If opening government's model is to say that you have companies like Huawei and Google, this also means like Nigeria is also subjected into geopolitical risk. And at a time where companies are particularly worried about lowering geopolitical risk, it's very important. Just look at how TSMC is building new factories in Arizona to de-risk for Taiwan, for example, right? So this means that having a depolitical and rely on market mechanisms is very important. But third of all, you also have like this administrative barrier on their side of the house, right? Notice that opening opposition cannot simply say that the government can simply control commercial law. That's not true. Because of the fact that in most countries, governments have huge amount of power to command countries, which oftentimes means, according to the constitution, they have to be politically subordinate to a legislation, which gives them a power, which means that they have to have administrative law to actually to restrict how they can use this money, how they're able to change this, right? So because of that, I don't think they're able to opt out of this. Before I move on, I'll take CO. Okay, I'll just move on. Let's compare it to opening opposition. So opening opposition's
Sorry,
entire
see you now.
No, thank you. Opening opposition's entire case is to talk about how governments are able to do this better, and we're able to flip that as well. We're also able to prove why government is able to do this better. I think that in addition to that, we're able to talk about why these government workers are explicitly bad and why they're not going to be able to do this better, why companies in comparison will do this well. And we're able to explain to you why government cannot simply like fiat away how they can control commercial power. How do you beat out over opening government? I think that opening government is correct, that Nigeria has a really good, is a really attractive place to attract people. But however, their explanation as to why exactly these companies are going to be effective is not really proven well, right? We've proven to you that government is inefficient. One, because regulation is slow. Two, governments oftentimes don't use price as a guidance, right? This means that they're subject to hijacked by political means. But three, they oftentimes don't have connection and the industry knowledge. For example, if I have someone like Warren Buffett or like Google, for example, investors are far more likely to trust us. For those reasons, CG, please.
Thank you. Calling on opposition.
Cool. Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Sure. Starting around 15 seconds. Hey, did you? Oh yeah. Sorry. Apologies. Some logistics. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1, go. I'll be trying to keep the speech very relatively simple. Let's start with closing government. Closing government has two main benefits. One, vested interest means that the companies will act well. Two, that experimentation will lead to better outcomes in long term. I don't think vested interests work for two obvious reasons. Note At the point of time, company is putting up a large set of costs. That probably means the government's providing enough benefits so that they can do it well. This probably means that you have lots of tax benefits as well as cesses and subsidies that closing government agrees to, which net buys into our case, proving why there's a less tax income. But also note, and this is very crucial, right? You're setting up a new city. You need many people to leave their families, to leave their current lifestyle, to leave the current stability they have, and move to the city so that the city is actually functional. You need many people to be employed in the city long term and staying in the city long term for the city to work. This crucially means you also have to provide a layer of benefits to these people who are moving in. I think Shaurya clearly proves to you that if you're providing these benefits, what do these benefits look like? They're probably tax reductions, cost reductions, etc., subsidies for people who are also moving in, right? At this point of time, that probably looks like the net amount of tax that the government is getting via the city is probably going to occur way in the long term. Probably for 30 to 40 years, you have a huge reduction in taxes because of being set up. This then means that, you know what, I'm not very sure whether these jobs increasing are particularly good. Why is this so? Because note, who are the people who are benefiting from these jobs? Who are the people benefiting from the investments, right? Shaurya clearly narrows down the debate wherein he points out that you do in the tech sector, especially in working with high tech, as in both government teams characterize, that probably means you probably have, let's say, a bachelor's from a fancy university, probably a master or PhD. You're a highly skilled tech worker. This doesn't trickle down to, let's say, the basic workers within these cities. You probably are just making rich tech workers even richer, giving them fancier jobs, etc. Right? On the other hand, where is money going away from? This goes away from all the sectors that Shaurya talks about. I'll prove that in our impacting a bit later. Secondly, experimentation is in fact very counterproductive. Because note, there is a limited capacity and there's a limited number of jobs in terms of tech that Nigeria can have in general, right? Because foreign direct investment is inherently limited. You want to be concentrated in one city so that city can succeed, which then means when you're splitting it amongst multiple cities, each of these cities are probably filled to a partial capacity because you know what, we have limited talent and limited investment, right? Which means also these cities are more economically vulnerable and it's likely to fail. There are no benefits in terms of experimentation. I think closing governments largely out. Now let's move on to opening opposition, clearly separate ourselves from them. I think the problem with opening government is that they primarily rely their case on government setting up these cities and then going ahead and accessing the same benefits that the government does. Over here, you need to ask a few questions in terms of how you credit their case. First, they may prove incentive, and I do think, let's say, as Shaurya points out, incentive probably exists as a positive for the government inside. But do they ever clearly prove whether the government has the capacity to go ahead and do these things well, especially when the government also probably doesn't have sufficient experience setting up these tech cities? I don't think they do. Our benefit is much clearer in terms of the governments, one, focusing on what they already currently do, wherein focusing on sectors that are already subsidizing and impact much more people. But secondarily, and I think this is relying on characterizing existing this debate in terms of Nigeria being, let's say, an attractive destination for tech investment. We probably rely on this interest and use pre-existing cities and set up infrastructure over there to go ahead and give a magnet for these investments, right? But it is much more probable than the CGOGO mechanism in terms of setting up these cities. Secondarily, note, I think the larger problem with, let's say, OG is that they rely on a very uncharitable framing in terms of, let's say, the way these technological companies operate. I think what we do much better than them is we're at structural reasons where even if these technological companies are very good, they want to actually, you know what, have the best governance standards, etc. They probably want to try multiple methods, but it's unlikely because that just leads to more failure in the long term because the macroeconomics and unit economics simply don't work out. Let's now bring OG into this debate. Over here, I think we need to make two broad observations on opening government. I think first, they shoot themselves in the foot when they say that Nigeria is a very attractive tourist destination, because that inherently means that you're still going to have a quantum of investment on-site opposition as well when you're not setting up these cities. That really reduces the need to set up these cities in the first place, right? Probably, we're going to have less investment, but still this investment is going to exist because you know what? People expect that they can make returns out of investing in Nigeria and setting up their companies over there. That probably means that Shaurya is able to access all those mechanisms in terms of still retaining a large increase in volume of tech that he sets up in his speech. But I think secondarily, and I think this is a large problem with OG, right? They largely rely their case that, you know what, we're going to have growth. We are, in fact, now, let's say, going to have more jobs and more money pumping in. The problem is, and I think carefully go through your notes, they never really go ahead and put a trickle down of these jobs or, let's say, the money pumping in. Their jobs, as both, let's say, as we clearly point out, are probably towards the upper middle class of rich, very qualified tech workers. They show no mechanism in terms of why it really goes down to the average city worker, right? No, it's the clear comparison over here. when people remain in their original cities, that probably means that, you know what, you're going to access all of the services within them, let's say employing people as cooks, maids, etc. The reason why this happens to a lesser degree in these newer cities, because these cities are going to be very gentrified. You're setting up a big company, many foreign companies are investing over here. It's probably very expensive to set up something over there. You probably don't want slums so that you don't affect the image of the city and hence reduce the viability of it to be invested in. Which then means it's very difficult for poor people to live over there in the first place and hence access all the jobs that can be set up over there. So even it does happen, happens to a very limited extent, POI-OG.
So instead of using tax for the band-aid solution of agricultural subsidies, isn't it better to have the best system to get the quickest development of local tech and modernization of agriculture?
So I think there's a huge problem over here. Because one, your solution is not quick, but two, you're not, let's say, basically giving tax subsidization for these people for multiple years so that they can actually recoup the investment and investment is viable, right? So you're basically talking about a large quantum period where these people simply do not pay taxes and they still pay lower rates because they're putting in such a large investment. That probably means that while, yes, you're creating wealth within that city, that wealth doesn't transfer back to the government in the first place. So the government has lesser spending potential. Secondarily, and impacts are very crucial when you weigh over other teams. When you're generating wealth for certain individuals who are initially maybe middle class, upper middle class, now become rich. When you're rich, yes, your demand increases, but your demand for luxury product increases, which are usually one, monopolized by highly skilled workers, or two, imported, right? These don't trickle down, as Shaurya clearly points out. But see, when you're getting jobs in MNCs, you also probably want to move to a better place, right? For example, France, Europe, etc., etc. You now have a unique opportunity to actually exit the country that you previously did. Look, while incentives may exist to remain, etc. Over here, you have far lower opportunity costs to go to a foreign country and hence have all the brain drain impacts, as Shaurya clearly points out, than otherwise. I think then, net, what do you get from closing opposition? A definitive harm in terms of lesser money going to the poor, which leads to debt traps, agricultural deficits, and just a weakening of the poor. That's the clearest impact in the debate. But secondarily, on over time, decrease in talent as well as wealth generation because of brain drain. That's much more certain than any other impact that we get. That's speculative and very, very long term. Hence, very, very proud to prepare.
Thank you, everyone. So that sorry.